Brother, sister, if you sat through the first list of warnings about dating and felt sure you were safe, because none of those 5 things applied to the person you're seeing, this biblical warning is for you next. Red flags don't always announce themselves as red. Some of them show up wearing the colors of devotion, dressed as attention, as protection, as spiritual leadership. That's what makes them dangerous. You already learned to watch for a rushed pace, avoided conversations, withheld access to their life, defensiveness about the future, and pressure toward intimacy. But there are 5 more patterns hiding underneath the ones you already know to name. Patterns so easy to mistake for love that most Christians walk straight past them and call it destiny. This is not a checklist meant to make you suspicious of every person who shows you kindness. It is a biblical warning built to protect your discernment, because Scripture never tells us to test everything, except our own hearts in a relationship. 1 John tells us plainly to test the spirits, to see whether they are from God, and that testing was never meant to stop at the door of romance. Jesus warned that false things come to us gently, in sheep's clothing, while what's underneath tells a different story. Today we are naming 5 more things you should never date someone who does. And by the end, you will see how all 10 signs, the first 5 and these 5, form one single pattern, someone who wants your affection more than they want your wholeness. Consider for a moment why so many Christians miss these signs even after living through the first 5. It is because the first 5 are behaviors you can point to on a calendar and a clock. How fast, how open, how honest. These next 5 live somewhere quieter, in your gut, in your prayer life, in the small unease you keep talking yourself out of. Discernment for these 5 will cost you something the first 5 didn't ask for. It will cost you honesty about a person you may already love. The first of these 5 is love bombing, an intensity of affection, gifts, and declarations that arrives faster than the relationship has earned. It feels like being chosen. It feels like finally being seen. But real love, the kind Scripture describes as patient and kind, does not need to overwhelm you in week 2 to prove itself. 1 Corinthians tells us love is patient, and patience cannot be manufactured through a flood of grand gestures. When someone showers you with a level of devotion that outpaces how well they actually know you, they are not building intimacy. They are building dependency. Ask yourself honestly, do I feel calm and steady around this person? Or do I feel swept somewhere I can't quite get my footing back from? A biblical warning worth hearing is this: the speed of affection is not the same as the depth of character. And if you cannot tell the difference yet, that itself is a sign to slow down and pray before you go further. Think of the difference between a small seed watered patiently over months and a hothouse flower forced open in days. One is built to last through a whole season. The other is built only to look beautiful the moment someone is watching. Song of Songs itself warns not to awaken love before it pleases, a caution about timing that our culture rarely repeats, but Scripture insists on. The second is a person who, slowly and almost invisibly, begins pulling you away from your people. It rarely looks like an ultimatum. It looks like a comment here, a jealous joke there, a subtle discouragement every time you mention your small group, your closest friend, or your family's opinion. Over weeks, you find yourself checking in with them before you check in with anyone else. Who has known and loved you far longer? This matters because Scripture consistently places us inside community, inside accountability, inside people. Who can see what we cannot see about ourselves when we are caught up in a relationship? Proverbs tells us to guard our hearts above all else, but a heart under the influence of isolation loses its best guardians one relationship at a time. If someone is quietly becoming the only voice you're allowed to listen to, that is not devotion. That is a closing door, and you should never date someone who is closing it. Pay attention to how a person speaks about the people who raised you and walked with you. Long before this relationship existed, respect for your community is rarely faked convincingly for long. And contempt for it, even disguised as playful teasing, tends to surface eventually, in what someone protects and what they slowly erode. The third sign is someone who mocks, minimizes, or slowly wears down your convictions. Maybe you've named a boundary around physical intimacy, around how you spend your Sunday mornings, around what kind of language or content you'll allow into your life. And instead of respecting it, they laugh it off, call you dramatic, or frame your convictions as immaturity, to be outgrown. This is one of the clearest biblical warnings in dating, because Scripture never treats conviction as something to be negotiated away by someone who claims to love you. If a person cannot honor the boundaries God has helped you build, they are not asking you to grow. They are asking you to shrink. Watch closely for how someone responds the third or fourth time you repeat a boundary. Not the first time, when everyone is still on their best behavior, but later, when the mask starts to slip. A person who genuinely respects you will ask questions about why a boundary matters to you, even if they don't fully understand it yet. Curiosity looks very different from contempt. And Scripture calls us to love that keeps no record of wrongs, not love that keeps a running tally of every conviction it still needs to wear down. The fourth is a person who is measurably different in private than they are in public. Around your pastor, your parents, or a room full of people watching, they are patient, warm, easygoing. The version of them you fell for. Alone with you, the tone shifts. Sharper, colder, quicker to control, quicker to blame. This gap between the public self and the private self is one of the oldest patterns named in Scripture, described as having a form of godliness while denying its power. A person's character is revealed not in the moments they know they're being watched, but in the ones they think are invisible. If you have quietly noticed two different people living inside one relationship, do not explain it away as stress or a bad day. Name it as what it is, a biblical warning that the version of them you can trust is smaller than the version you've been shown. This is why Scripture places such weight on being known by those who see us in ordinary, unguarded moments. A small group, a family dinner, an accountability partner who has no reason to only see your best behavior. If no one in your life has ever seen this person on an ordinary Tuesday, ask yourself why that door has stayed so carefully closed. The fifth, and the most dangerous of all 10 signs across both of these warnings, is spiritual manipulation. Someone who uses the language of faith, guilt, or God's will to move you toward what they want. It sounds like, if you really trusted God, you'd be further along with me by now. It sounds like a godly woman would just submit to this. Or, real faith means you don't need to feel comfortable, you need to obey. This is the hardest red flag to see, because it borrows the very words you love. Scripture, faith, submission, obedience, and turns them into pressure instead of truth. Ephesians warns believers plainly to let no one deceive them with empty words. And this is exactly what empty words sound like when they're wrapped in a Bible verse, pulled out of its meaning to serve someone else's timeline instead of God's. Notice that true spiritual authority in Scripture always moves toward your freedom and your closeness with God, never towards someone else's convenience wearing His name. When a verse is used to make you smaller, quieter, or more compliant to one person's timeline, instead of closer to Christ Himself, that is not teaching. That is control, borrowing a pulpit it was never given. Here is the pattern underneath all 10 signs from both warnings. The rushed pace, the avoided conversations, the withheld access to their life, the defensiveness about the future, the pressure toward intimacy, and now the love bombing, the isolation, the mocked convictions, the two-faced character, the spiritual manipulation. Every single one is a different costume worn by the same thing. A person who wants control of you more than they want covenant with you. Love, the kind God actually designed for marriage, does not need to rush you, isolate you, mock you, hide from you, or manipulate you with His own name. Love, as 1 Corinthians describes it, does not insist on its own way. If someone's affection only survives by insisting on their own way, you are not looking at love. You are looking at its counterfeit, and a counterfeit is still worth naming, even when it's wearing a cross around its neck. Ask yourself which of these 10 a person would still be willing to release if you named it out loud today. Because a counterfeit tends to defend itself the moment it's discovered, while real love simply asks what it can do to earn your trust back. If you recognized even one of these 10 signs while watching, hear this clearly. This biblical warning was never meant to shame you for who you're dating, or who you already gave your heart to. It was meant to hand you back your discernment gently, before another season passes you by. God is not asking you to become suspicious of every person who loves you. He is asking you to test what's in front of you against what He has already shown you is true. Patient, kind, honoring, honest in public and in private, and never afraid of your convictions. Bring this to Him in prayer tonight. Ask Him plainly to show you what you may have been too close to see on your own, and trust that the same God who warns you is the same God who will not leave you without an answer. Whatever season you are in tonight, newly dating, deeply attached, or quietly wondering if you've already ignored too many of these signs. God has not left you to figure this out with willpower alone. He has given you His Spirit, His Word, and people around you, who were placed there specifically to help you see what love is supposed to look like. Bring your discernment to Him honestly tonight, and trust that the same grace that named these 10 signs for you is the same grace that will walk with you through whatever you decide to do next. If this biblical warning named something you needed to hear, type "I hear the warning" in the comments below, so this community can stand with you as you bring it before God. And if you want more of these biblical warnings, the ones that name what culture calls love but Scripture calls a counterfeit, subscribe to Biblical Warning now, because the next warning is already waiting. And it may be the one that protects your heart before it costs you anything at all.